Okay. Um, I'm still new at this. This is, I think, my second video. Yeah, I know. My second video that I'm making for my Ask the Dog Walker YouTube channel. And my name is Deirdre, and I am a professional dog walker pet sitter. And I am on vacation in Cape Cod. I usually live in New York, so I talk too fast most of the time. And it's a really wet week up here on Cape Cod. We had sunshine at the beginning of the week, but it is pouring. My hair is wet because I got out of the shower a little while ago. But I don't get too glammed up. So I'm going to make a series of short videos. I'm going to try and keep them 7 minutes or shorter. And this video, there's an introductory video you can watch, which explains why I started the channel. But I'm here to basically help people navigate responsible pet parenting. I don't call it ownership. You're an owner, technically, but I don't like to think I own the animals. There are a lot of topics that I'm going to cover, but the topic I want to cover right now is just one example, one of many I can give you, of people who adopted a dog the wrong way. And I know this story really, really well because I lived it firsthand. Because when I was a kid, I grew up in a house with, there were 7 people in my family, and it was not a big house. And I'm the youngest of 5 kids, and I always desperately, I wanted a dog. Really wanted a dog. I mean, I wanted a cat, I wanted a pony. Every Christmas, I asked Santa Claus for all of the above. But really, I just have always, I came out of the womb, I just love dogs. I can't explain it. I don't know why, but I've always been like that. And my older brothers and sisters, people were allergic. And I think when I was very little, my mother told me a story that the family adopted a puppy from one of my brother's teachers at school. And this was kind of typical, this is going back in the late 1960s. This dog was maybe 6 months old. And my parents didn't know how to train a dog. You know, they'd had dogs when they were kids, but that was in the 1920s and 30s, and people didn't do like dog training, and dogs lived outside, and everything was different. And it's different, you know, when you have a dog growing up as a child, who's doing all the work taking care of the dog and training the dog? Your parents are. So when you become an adult and you want to get a dog, you probably don't know as much about dogs as you think you do just because you had one when you were a kid. That's a whole nother video. But today's video, here I am as a kid, desperately want a dog. They had a puppy for a couple of months, and it wasn't trained, and everybody was allergic except for me, and everybody was sneezing, and so they rehomed the dog. I don't know whatever happened to that dog. I was like 2, so I don't remember it. And I remember my mother telling me a funny story that they couldn't, it was a rambunctious dog that was running all over the house, and the only one that could get a leash on the dog was me, because apparently the dog understood that I was a toddler, I was a baby, and would, as crazy and nuts as it was, it apparently would calm down for me and hold still, and I was the only one that could walk up to it and put a leash on it when it was time to take the dog for a walk. So that dog didn't last long, but through my whole childhood, I kept bringing home every stray dog I could find. I would walk like a few blocks away to a different street or a different neighborhood, and I'd like call dogs out of their front yard and bring them home and tell my mother, I don't know where he came from, he was lost. I brought home like 15 or 20 stray dogs, and my mother always found their homes, so we never got to keep them. When I was about 8 years old, my mother just saw an ad in the local classified papers, local papers classifieds. And it was an ad for an Airedale Terrier, which somehow she got the notion in her head. She was on this big kick of researching our Irish heritage history and the family tree and all that stuff. And for some reason, she got it in her head that the Airedale Terrier was an Irish breed, and so that would fit. And it was also like a curly-haired dog, more like poodle-y sort of hair. And I don't know that they shed. And I don't think the idea of hypoallergenic dogs had caught on back then, but for some reason, She saw this classified ad for this dog somebody in our town was putting up for adoption. So she decided that maybe that would be the dog for us. So we went over to the house. The two older kids in the family were like teenagers in their early 20s, and they were not anything, they're great, basically adults. But me, the three younger, I was the youngest. I had a brother 5 years older than me and a sister 3 years older than me. So there were the three younger kids. And we went over to the house. It was a young couple. They had a small dog of their own, like a Shih Tzu or something. And they had two very small children who were like under the age of 5. They were toddlers, maybe a baby and like a 3-year-old. And the story that we were told, and here is where all of your red flags should go off, because these people didn't know what they were doing adopting the dog out. And my parents didn't know what they were doing adopting the dog. And everything I tell you, pay close attention to, because every step of the way, it was the adults making mistakes. First red flag, we went over to the house, and they told us the dog was like 5 or 6 years old. Now, an Airedale is a pretty big dog. It's a large terrier. I think it's the biggest in the terrier breed. It is a large, muscular dog. They're not small. And so a 5 or 6-year-old Airedale is getting up there. I don't know how long they live, maybe 10 or 11, maybe 12 years, but big dogs usually don't live as long. So this dog at this point in his life could basically be considered on his way to being a senior. It's not a young dog. And the story was that the reason these people had the dog was because the dog had lived with the woman's father and he had died. And he had been an elderly gentleman and he had been a retired doctor. So you had a dog who had spent his entire life living in a home with one person, a calm, quiet senior citizen. And apparently he knew the family, the woman's kids and her family and her dog. So he'd been exposed to them, but he hadn't lived with them. And basically they wanted, we met them and we were all good with dogs, and the dog was very sweet and friendly and he seemed fine. We met them one time. We spent maybe a half an hour at the house, maybe less. And my parents decided that it had gone well enough that we were going to adopt this dog. His name was Pal, and Pal came to live with us. And I was so happy. I was so happy we finally had a dog. But there were other red flags. Pal never really seemed to connect with anybody too well. And I can remember he growled at me a few times, and I was 8 years old, and I didn't realize that a dog growling was potentially a dog that was going to do something later. And I didn't tell my parents that he growled at me from time to time when I walked past him, because I didn't want to get him in trouble. And I was afraid that if he got in trouble, they would give him away and we wouldn't keep him. So I didn't want anything to happen to this dog to go live somewhere else. I wanted him to stay. I remember a couple of times my older sister would come home later at night from work or whatever, waitressing, and if you woke him up, he growled at her a few times when she came in. Now, we only had this dog for a month, 2 months. No, we got him right after Christmas. We had him like a month to the day. It was a busy household. My father went to work every day, but my mother stayed home with the dog. But you had 3 school-age children getting up in the morning and getting hustled out to school and coming home at lunch and going back, and there was a lot of back and forth. And then you had the 2 older kids who were in and out all the time, going to work and high school and college and all that stuff. So it was 7 people in a house, in a small house, and there was a lot of activity. This dog wasn't used to that. He'd lived with one person, one senior citizen, his whole life, okay? And all of a sudden, he's thrust into, at an advanced age, a home where there was just a whole lot of stuff going on all the time. One day, when we had him exactly a month, I came home from school. It was February, and I was standing in the front doorway, and he was sitting there was like an archway that went into the rest of the house. And my father was home that day getting ready to go on a business trip. He was in the dining room packing his briefcase because he was about to go away on a business trip. My oldest brother was home in between college classes. My oldest sister was at work in New York City, and my two siblings that were closest in age to me were both home with like colds. So I was the only one who had gone to school that day. And we lived 2 blocks away. So I walked home for lunch. That was the routine. It was normal. And I walked in the door and I took my coat off and I hung it on the peg by the wall, on the wall. And as I turned from hanging up my coat, the dog was sitting in the doorway that I had to walk through to get into the rest of the house. And as I turned towards him, he jumped up, and I was little. I was 8 years old. I was a little kid, and he was a big dog. He jumped up with no warning. I didn't do anything. I didn't touch him. I didn't step on him. I didn't do anything. And he grabbed me by the face like this. Like this. And he basically shook me like a rat, like a terrier would do to a rat. And then he let go, and he sat back down and looked at me. And I screamed. And I remember in that one instant, looking up. My little face was so small, and this dog was so big that I remember looking up, and I can remember seeing all the ridges on the roof of his mouth as his mouth was over my entire face. Blood everywhere. I instantly started to scream. I said, he bit me, and everybody, my mother came running from the kitchen, my father came running from the dining room, my brother came running from the other room, everybody converged on the hallway. Chaos ensued. My mother dragged the dog, my brother dragged the dog to the basement stairs and put him downstairs. My mother rushed me to the kitchen sink to try and rinse the blood off to see how bad it was. And then all of a sudden everybody's day changed. And they threw me in the car, and our family doctor lived on the next street. So they threw me in the car and drove me over there. And he called the hospital and got the plastic surgeon. It was a mess. It was chaos. I was in really bad shape. This was a very bad dog bite. It was one bite. It wasn't even like a full-on attack. He just jumped up, bit me once, and sat down. And he did it took the blink of an eye, 2 seconds or less, and this dog did a monumental amount of damage to my face. I was in the hospital emergency room. I got home 10 hours later. I was in surgery with the plastic surgeon, literally for hours on the table. You can't really see it now, but I have a scar all the way down the side of my face, and this is 41 years ago. I have this scar still. I have scars you can't really see all on my lip. There were 3 or 4 spots on my lip where they had to sew the inside of my lip. They had to sew here, here, here. This whole side of my nose, and you can't see these scars because this isn't a great camera, but I have scars here and here that go all the way down here. This whole part of my nose was hanging off. I looked like Frankenstein when they were done. And it happened like that. And it was completely unprovoked. I can look back now and think, well, there must have been something I did in that turning motion that startled him. And I think back now and I'm thinking, well, it's a really sad story. None of this was the dog's fault. That's the point. I come home from the hospital, and hours later, it's late at night, I have a face full of stitches, swollen, bleeding, bruised, a mess. The first thing I do when I walk in the door is I look for the dog. My parents must have thought I was out of my mind. I'm sure they all thought that I would be so terrified of him that I wouldn't want to see him anywhere in the house when I got home. And the first thing I did when I walked in the door was I asked, well, where's Pal? I, with everything that was wrong with me, was upset because I felt like I had gotten him in trouble. And it was somehow my fault that he had bitten me. And I didn't want anybody to be mad at him, and I didn't want him to get punished for biting me. And I remember my parents kind of looking at each other over my head when I'm like, where's the dog? And I think they both were like, it hadn't even occurred to them that I would even want the dog there when I came home, and that they would have to field questions about where he was and what happened to him. And so they kind of scrambled quickly and gave me the story of, well, we couldn't really let him stay after that, so we sent him to live on a farm. Now, I did not know in that moment. I burst out crying. I was, don't cry. You have a face full of stitches. my mother was afraid I was going to pop all the stitches out of my face, and just the last thing they needed me to do was just have a breakdown. And I just bawled my eyes out because the dog was gone and he wasn't coming back, and I felt guilty. I thought it was my fault and that I had gotten him in trouble. And I was devastated, absolutely devastated. I waited all my life for a dog, and then we had one, and he, of all the people in the family for him to bite, he bit me badly, and it was all my, I just felt terrible. So I was heartbroken, I was bawling my eyes out, and I believed the farm story. But what I learned later, as an adult, was that that dog didn't make it. He didn't live through the end of the day. This was 1974, and there wasn't any question that a dog that bit a kid in those days that way, that was it. That was his death sentence. I didn't know that then. I learned it much later. I don't believe the dog ever made it out of our basement. I've heard different versions of the story of what happened to him, but I don't. He didn't get a fair shake, and none of it was his fault. And what I learned later was that my parents had called the family we adopted him from and told them what happened, and they admitted that the reason they decided not to keep the dog was because he had snapped at their smaller dog, and he had, I guess, sort of snapped or growled at their small children. And I guess they thought because I was older and I was the youngest kid in the house and we were all good with dogs and I loved them, they assumed that I would not do anything to provoke the dog, like very small children might, and that it would be safe. But the family that adopted him to us had already seen red flags that this dog shouldn't go into a home with children or small dogs. They knew that. They didn't tell that to my parents before we decided to take the dog, and my parents didn't ask. And they didn't observe this dog long enough. The assumptions I can make now, knowing what I know, we also didn't understand, nobody thought about the fact that you don't take a dog that age who has known nothing but living in a house with one human, a quiet, calm, elderly, retired person, and insert him into this life of basic chaos with children all over the place and constant activity. At the age that he was at, it's likely that he was having hearing problems. It's likely that he was having vision problems. It's likely that he was easily startled. Knowing what I know now, if you walk past him, he might not hear you coming up until you were suddenly there. And maybe that's why he was growling at us, or he might not see you until you were suddenly in front of him. He might not have been able to make out what he was seeing. I'll never know. It also turned out, they admitted, that he was a lot older. He was like actually 10 or 11. They downplayed his age. They basically lied about his age because they figured nobody would take him if he was old. And they made him much younger. I think they told us he was 5, 4 or 5, maybe 6. And he was actually significantly, almost double the age that they told us he was. So my guess would be that the dog was dealing with old age health issues, possibly arthritis problems or not feeling well that nobody would have detected or looked for. And was put in a very high stress environment compared to what he had known all of his life. Certainly must have been out of sorts missing his owner that had died, and then the only other humans he'd ever known, and he was thrust into this ridiculously different high stress situation for him. And he had been giving people red flags. The dog had been giving everybody, every adult human involved in the decision, signals, warnings, and red flags all along. He had been telling them, don't send me to live with little kids. They should have tried to find him a home with somebody that could recreate a similar situation. You know what? He probably would have been absolutely fine, and he could have lived out his days and had a good, calm, quiet life with somebody. And instead, all of the adults involved in deciding what to do with this dog made just blanketly bad decisions right across the board. I paid for it with a horrible dog bite to my face and a very traumatic experience. And the dog paid for it with his life. And so the moral of the story is, you don't ignore the warning signs that a dog gives you. You don't ignore the growls. You don't write it off. You don't downplay it. You understand that they're telling you something before they actually bite you. And when you're trying to look at adopting a dog, if you're the person trying to get, I see an awful lot of fosters and rescuers try and push dogs into homes that are not appropriate for them because they just want the dog to go to a good place. And it may be good people and a good family, but that doesn't mean it's the appropriate home for the dog. And this is a perfect example of a dog that could have done very well for the rest of his life had the people, humans making decisions for him, made better decisions. And I'm probably going to feel guilty about it for the rest of my life, to be honest with you. And none of it was my fault either. I don't want to see people make the same mistake. And there are things you need to learn to look for before you adopt a dog, that you really need to make sure that it's the right fit for your sake, for the sake of any children you have in the home or that may come to visit you, and for the dog's sake. Because when the humans make bad decisions, the one who pays for it the most is the dog. That's one dog bite story I have under my belt. I've been mauled twice, badly, as a child, and somehow still love dogs. And I ended up with a wonderful family dog a couple of years later. And I've had pets. I've got a great dog now. But educate yourself before you go out and adopt a dog. Learn about dog behavior, learn about what to look for, learn about body language and signals, and do your research. And if you're a foster or somebody trying to rehome a dog, don't BS people. Don't lie to people or sugarcoat things because you so desperately want that dog to get into a home, because it may come back and bite you in the tushy. And it's just, if the dog ends up paying for it with their life, you didn't do the dog any favors. That's my lesson for today. It was a hard, sad lesson learned, but I carry it with me, and I hope other people can learn from it. And I'm always going to feel bad for Pal.